There never was but one Paducah, my dear friends, and there never will be but one Paducah. So her boastful, cheerful friends claim for her, and I claim it for her too. Now, what with the enforced uniformity of chain stores, shopping malls, and filling stations, and modernistic storefronts, and so forth, I admit that the downtown of this city looks as much like any other smallish interior city you'd mind to think of. And what with the propane and carbon monoxide and gasoline spilt on greasy concrete, and traffic congestion, jet noise and whatnot, this town even smells and sounds like any man's town. Yet it is still Paducah. Ghosts of riverboat captains, steamboat traders, still journey the Ohio and gather on our docks, fill their pipes with our fine bluegrass tobacco, and tell tales of their travels and adventures. Spirits of long-gone friends and family still gather in old crooked rocking chairs on creaking porches and still pass around mason jars full of homemade hospitality until the early hours of the morning, just telling and retelling tales about Chief Paducah, old Judge Priest, Della Barnes, John Scopes, or any of the number of fables and fantasies that are part and parcel of living here in Paducah. Now, I'd like to think it's not just the dead, but also the living that help maintain the outstanding qualities of the city's former days. Her saving grace of tolerance, her instinctive hospitality, her noble and commendable vanity of self-satisfaction, her persevering adversity and calamities, her love of jokes, and most importantly for us here today, her endearing love of yarn spinning. And I ask you now, what better place, I wonder what better place to unravel a few yarns than here, where the past and the future meet in the comfort and shade of our quiet home. We're going to take a little tour today, so if you'll come with me, we'll meet a few of the folks that reside here. In 1907, the 17-year-old Fate Maribel began playing piano and calliope on a Mississippi steamer, JS. By 1917, he'd started his own riverboat band called the Kentucky Jazz Band. It was based out of St. Louis. It was unique in that it hired only jazz players from New Orleans. Mr. Maribel is often credited with single-handedly preventing the extinction of jazz during these tough times. One of his more notable members in the jazz band was Louis Armstrong. In fact, so many members of the band went on to fame and fortune that the group became known amongst insiders as the Floating Conservatory. Mr. Maribel.
Look up jazz in the record catalog. You won't find the name of any composers. No Brahms, no Berlins, no Beethovens, and no Gershkins. You'll find men like Armstrong, Basic, Eldridge, Freeman, and Coltrane, the men who play the stuff. See, because jazz is not a song. It's not anything that can be written down on paper. Oh, great jazz moments might be recorded, remembered, and respected. But jazz itself, it can't be wrapped, stamped, or packaged. Why, if anybody did try to write it down, and no one have, it wouldn't have done most of the jazzmans any good. For I never knew of one of them, worth his weight, could read a note. Of course, things changed later on, but the early boys, they knew what jazz was. They might begin with a familiar tune and play all around it, taking out bits here and adding riffs there, whatever struck their fancy as they went along. And by the time they was done with it, it was something completely new and different. To them, jazz was what, to musicians, searching together, brought to it, took from it, and found in it. The song was just a place to start. Back 100 years ago, a fellow by the name of Scott Joplin was playing his piano at the Maple Leaf Club in Sedalia, Missouri, inventing something called ragtime, Another man by the name of W.C. Handy was playing the clubs in Memphis, Tennessee, reinventing something called the blues. But down in New Orleans, that's where everything was really happening. That's where Buddy Bolden and Bunk Johnson was making names for themselves, blowing their cornets out in the streets and in the funeral parades, making sounds that nobody had ever quite heard before. See, New Orleans wanted music something furious. They loved parades back then more than they do now. And they would find any excuse to have one. Births, weddings, deaths, burials, welcome homes, going aways, holidays, weekends, weekdays, weeknights. Another thing about these parades and marching societies was that they all had something called the second line. That second line was the line at the end of the parade, made up of marching children, banging pots and pans, imitating the adults. Crazy as it sounds, it's in a love of performing throughout a whole lot of kids. Kid Ory, George Bigger, and Louis Armstrong are just some of the graduates of this second line. If these parades is where jazz was born, then it was raised in a little area by the name of Storyfield. And that's where I came in. The most easiest and convenient way to travel was by riverboat. And I had been playing jazz, piano, and clapping since 1907, and sort of earned a name for myself. And when Storyville closed in 1917, all of those musicians wandered onto my boats. And I gave them jobs, as many as I could, all up and down the Ohio, the Mississippi, the Arkansas, and the Illinois rivers. But when the steel mills and all closed down, we had to start packing and find jobs elsewhere. Some ended up with rent-parted music called pitch and boogie, it was called then. Boogie woogie, they called it later. But true boogie woogie is not really played until they have a battered up piano and the tenants screaming on the outside and the landlord hollering at them on the inside. But someone once said that love takes a course like that. When you got it, you got it. When it's gone, it's gone. It's been that way from the start.
The next gentleman we're going to meet was the first United States Marshal in the Oklahoma Territories back in the 1890s. A preacher's boy, born on a plantation down in Callaway County. Never smoked, nor drank, nor stalked anything bigger than a rabbit or a squirrel. But at 31, he was appointed to one of the most powerful positions in law enforcement. Now, Oklahoma in the 1890s was the most dangerous place in the country. By the end of this gentleman's 3-year term, 9 criminals had been killed outright, 47 more had been hung, and over 50,000 had been jailed. By the time he resigned office, there was not a single outstanding warrant on a criminal anywhere in the territory. Now, few lawmen then and since have been braver, and fewer still have ever got the job done quite like Colonel E.D. Nix.
George Bitter Creek Newcomb, member of the Doolin gang, close pal of its leader Bill Doolin, had a streak of poetry in him. He was the one that gave his sweetheart the fanciful name Rose of Cimarron. Was a fitting title too, since she was beginning to bloom just like a rose when she came with her family from Texas to the homestead they had staked on the Cimarron River in Kansas in 1889. Rose had just turned 14 and was beginning to go with the boys. With her quick wit and physical maturity, she became a belle at country dances where the territory cowboys courted the prettier daughters of the nesters. Fiddles creaked, and the jug was sometimes passed till near dawn. Bitter Creek was quite a frequenter of these shindigs also. He started talking to Rose. The name he gave her only served to build up her reputation for beauty. That was Rose's first love affair, and her infatuation was complete, although within conventional bounds. Her nature was essentially a simple one. like all girls for a time and place, she looked forward to marriage, settling down. Bitter Creek probably felt the same way then, but due to circumstances and his own recklessness, sucked into outlawing before he and Rose ever got around to it. By that time, Rose, so deeply in love, and her head so full of the silly notion of being able to reform her man, she was swept along. She was never really a bad girl, in the technical meaning the Times gave that phrase. Conventionality was too deep-grained in her. But this will seem a strange statement to make about a girl who, before she turned 18, was a scout for the worst outlaw gang we'd ever faced, who smuggled medicines and supplies to them when they were holed up with injuries, who went among ordinary people with her deceptive look of innocence on liaison work for them, and who, in one instance, helped them shoot their way out of a trap and rode away with them. Yet, I have every reason to believe my statement is the truth. We were unaware of Rose's dealings with the Doolin gang until we found that she had made regular trips from her home near Guthrie to the gang's hideout and had visited them in other hideouts. No one ever suspected that the slip of a country girl in a gingham dress and sunbonnet, riding about the prairies, was doing the errands of the territory's worst outlaws. It was known that she had a crush on Bitter Creek. That infatuation was thought to have ended when he went bad. However, we found out differently in the fall of 1894 when our men cornered the Doolin gang in the town of Ingalls, Kansas. We trapped them there in the Trilby Saloon, next door to the Pierce Hotel, where they were desperately trying to make it across the street to get to their horses at the livery stables. One of the men trying to make it across the street was Bitter Creek, and we shot and he fell in the middle of the street. Doolin and several other gang members tried to grab him and drag him to the stables. As they made it to the stable door, we shot Doolin, causing him to stagger and drop Bitter Creek. Now, about this time, from up on the second floor of the hotel, a young woman was looking down just in time to see Bitter Creek fall to the dirt. It was Rose of Cimarron. She and some other ladies of the town had closeted themselves in that upstairs room from which lead was being pumped out at our officers. There was no stairway up or down. The only way to get up or down was a ladder leaning outside, exposed to gunfire. Rose saw Bitter fall. She buckled on a cartridge belt, snatched up a Winchester, and dashed for the ladder to go to the aid of the murderous thug she loved. She found she couldn't make it that way. Our officers were pelting the hotel hot and heavy. So she gathered some sheets, knotted them together, and used them to slip down out a window on the opposite side of the hotel. Our men were unaware of her presence until, despite the gunfire, she dashed into the open to go to the aid of Bitter Creek. Even though she was carrying additional ammunition and another weapon for the criminals, our men held her fire. That was chivalry taken to the extreme. Doolin, some other gang members, noticing the fire was being held, rushed out to help Rose drag Bitter Creek into the stables. Once inside, he ordered gang members Dynamite Dick and Red Buck to help Bitter and Rose mount horses and ordered them to make an escape out the back while they kept covering fire on the front. Well, Doolin and Dalton started firing, and we saw Bitter, Rose, Dynamite, and Red Buck spur their horses from the back of the stables. They hadn't gone more than 100 yards when Bitter pitched unconscious from the saddle. Rose dismounted and flung herself down beside him. We noticed the firing stop. We saw Doolin and Dalton spur their horses in the direction of Red Buck and Dynamite Dick, who hadn't paused at Bitter Creek's mishap. Now, Doolin caught up with Dynamite Dick and Red Buck. His gun flashed, and he shot Red Buck's head off. He started cursing. He said, "You yellow so-and-sos, get back here. We're not about to leave Bitter Creek and Rose." Now, about that time, my deputy, Leif Shadley, had left his cover and was advancing on the wounded man, Winchester in firing position. He was so intent upon Rose and her fallen lover, he had noticed that Dalton had turned back from riding with Doolin. Dalton saw him, shot him, and killed him. The other gang members followed, Doolin, Dynamite, and then the cursing Red Buck. They hoisted Bitter into the saddle, Rose mounted, and they all galloped away. Our men, unmounted, were unable to follow. We were itching to get our hands on Rose after that Ingalls fight. She's nowhere to be found. She kept herself closeted away until after Bitter Creek's death. By then, locating her was of little consequence. We had taken Doolin into custody the following year. And in the train ride to jail, I asked him about Rose. His face softened. He turned to me and said, "Marshal, she was just a sweet little country girl, unfortunate enough to have fallen in love with an outlaw. Why, she would have given her life for Bitter Creek, and he worshiped her. Just not enough to go straight." Well, Marshal, people thought, well, you know what, but I tell you, she was as good a girl as ever lived. Why, everyone in the gang adored her. If anyone had ever dared to intimate that she was anything other than what a good woman ought to be, any one of us would have shot and killed her accuser on the spot. We finally took Rose into custody the following year in a general roundup of the associates of the outlaws, following Doolin's escape from the jail we'd delivered him to. It was done in order to eliminate any avenue of help to which he might turn. We were pretty sure that Rose had cut her ties with the gang, was going straight. We just could not afford to take the chance of being wrong. My deputy, Bill Tillman, found her staying with family where her parents had placed her to save themselves and her the notoriety the Ingalls incident had caused. She went willingly, and when Tillman locked her up, he came to my office. "Marshal, I'm ashamed for having arrested that girl. She doesn't belong in jail. Well, I believe everything Doolin said about her." Well, I had Rose brought to my office. I sent for her parents. She was little more than a child. Her cheeks were pink, her face winsome, and her eyes held that shine of innocence. She had said that most of her trips to the gang's hideouts had been to get Bitter Creek to leave. He kept promising. He just never kept his promise. She said that she had had no dealings with any of the gang members and was going straight. Now, our investigations had confirmed this, and her parents, who were decent country people of the most upright sort, were eager to help in her reformations. The dealings of the Ingalls incident had grieved them deeply. So finally, I suggested that she plead guilty to aiding and abetting outlaws, and my office would suggest a short sentence in the Federal Women's Reformatory in Framingham, Massachusetts. Both she and her parents agreed. Rose was sentenced, and she was released a few months later. I always wondered what it was that caused a woman like Rose of Cimarron to go to such extremes to be with a man like Bitter Creek. I also wondered to what extreme she might have gone if he hadn't been killed. I wondered if she thought of him the rest of her life, if she regretted her actions, or if deep down, sometimes, she missed the excitement. She never said. Now myself, I'm merely a mint julep colonel, commissioned by the governor of Kentucky himself. And like I always wrote in my letters to Bobby Johnson and his brother Little Red, who were to later operate a successful Johnson's brokerage at 3rd and Washington, always strive to be manly men, especially when being tested by life's decisions. I also advised them that they would find that a Kentuckian always commands more respect elsewhere than he'll ever find in Kentucky. Take my deputy, Bill Tillman, for example. He was a premier example of an exemplary peace officer, both honored and feared, depending upon your perspective. He was just another native son. I'm sure that when you've become accustomed to our type of character, it's merely normal behavior. Oh, and was always fond of telling people that I was from Paducah, the home of that other handsome gentleman, Irvin S. Cobb. Oh, and let me graciously thank my nephew, another Paducan, Herman Graham, for his background work on my times as a U.S. Marshal in the Oklahoma Territories in Oklahoma Hombres Revisited. I married a decent, upright woman in my hometown. We'd played together as children in Coldwater. We met again later at a church social in Fulton, Kentucky. We were wed. You know, I never had another girlfriend before or since. But had I ever thought of it, I'd have probably thought of one just like Rose of Cimarron.
The man we're about to meet died September 30th, 1991, of what the local coroner termed apparent desperation. Doe showed up earlier that day at the regional airport and was desperately trying to swap his only worldly possession, a leather bomber jacket, for a plane ticket out west. When nobody took him up on his offer, he jumped the fence and grabbed the tail section of a departing Memphis-bound flight and became airborne with the aircraft. He lost his grip at about 300 feet and fell to his death at the south end of the airport. He had no identification on him. The FBI had no records. The Paducah Sun published a picture of the deceased. They broke tradition in hopes of finding out who he was. Copies of his dental records were sent to special centers all across the country. He appeared in short segments on local and national television, but it was all to no avail. No further information was ever received. At his memorial service, about 30 strangers came to pay their respects to our John Doe.
Time was when people would help a guy out. Now, I'm not bitter, mind you. It's just at that time I had something I really had to do. Where do I start? There's a movie I saw one time. It's about a business owner who wanted to run for president. Well, he had lots of money, so everybody hated him, but nobody really knew him, you know? So anyway, he made some mistakes, and people hated him even more, and he never got to become president. But then when he died, I guess people started feeling kind of sorry for him and wanted to know just a little bit more about him. So anyway, this reporter starts running around town trying to figure out what he's really all about. Well, he never puts it all together, but we do, and we find out that this guy was just a real lonely man who wanted to be happy and didn't know how to go about it. He thought he could make people love him, but he couldn't. And he died in a desperate moment, all alone, and we never find out anything about him. But that's not the point. It's not the point. The point is, When the reporter was going around town interviewing people, he interviewed this old man in a rest home. He said he had this great thing to say I'll always have in my head. He said something like, "You know, a fellow will always remember things you wouldn't think you'd remember. You take me, for example. One day back, many years ago, I was crossing over to Jersey on a ferry. And as we were pulling in, another ferry was pulling out. And on it was a girl. A white parasol she was holding. She had on a white dress. I only saw her for a second, and she didn't even see me, but I bet a month hasn't gone by that I didn't think of that girl. And I thought, boy, isn't that true? I mean, don't we all just have people we can't get off our heads? I know I did. Her name was Annabelle. Except she wasn't just somebody I'd seen on a boat, no. I knew her most of my life. We grew up together. We were childhood sweethearts. Except that we really weren't. We never crossed that line. But I know we both felt it was true. She's the most beautiful girl you could ever meet. Extremely intelligent, charming, and funny. Every guy's dream, and I knew that. I was just always afraid to say anything for fear that she didn't feel the same way. Then one day she left for college. And as the months went on and she was no longer a part of my life, I started to feel that something was gone that should be there. And it wasn't something I could express in a letter or over the phone. Well, time went on and it got worse and worse. I thought about her every day. Every single day. All day. And the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabelle Lee. And the stars never rise, but I see the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabelle Lee. Then one day her letters became less frequent and she stopped calling as much. And it became pretty obvious that she was drifting further and further away. It was about that time I saw that movie and I realized no matter what I did, I was not going to become that old man in the rest home, wondering what if and just never knowing. So it was now or never. I packed a duffel bag and I set off for college in Memphis to find out. I had no money. I had to hitchhike, and to make a long story short, a trip that should have taken a day and a half had stretched into more than a week. Well, by that time it was much more than just an idea. It had become a mission that I had to complete. After struggling to do something that hard, you got to see it through, right? And by the time I'd reached Paducah, I was tired, broke, hungry, and desperate. All I had left of my name was this leather bomber jacket, and I'd offered it to everybody in Paducah Airport that afternoon in exchange for a ticket. I even offered them to send the money later, but no one would help. I guess I must have been quite a sight, though. Unshaven, dirty, no shower in a week. But that didn't occur to me then, you know. All I was focused on was getting to Memphis. I don't know when the idea first came to me. Seemed to make perfect sense, you know, if I could just get a good grip on the tail and maybe brace my feet up against the wings. I was tired, but I still had my strength. I could sure hold on for the 20 minutes or so it took to get to Memphis. So I waited till the last passenger gotten on. I made a dash for the plane and I jumped on to the tail and hugged it with all my strength. But what I didn't count on were the winds, the shaking of the plane, and the cold. The rest you know. So as it all turned out, I never did get to see Annabelle again. Oh, but I know she was waiting for me. I know she just wanted me to say something. I know she was waiting for me. But now I'm waiting for her. And our love, it was stronger by far than those who were older than we. By far those wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea could ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabelle Lee.
This lady was a talented and versatile musician who became one of Paducah's first career women. In her day, a girl of genteel upbringing was expected to play the piano and sing a bit as an introduction to the social graces. But she refused to conform. She refused to accept a life with such limited musical horizons. Following graduation from high school in 1908, she moved to New York City, where she enjoyed lifelong success as a concert singer, voice coach, music teacher, choral director, and a compiler of the folk songs of Kentucky. It was in this later endeavor that she made her most lasting contributions to music and to the history and understanding of her native state. We will always be indebted to Miss Mary Wheeler.
Music was my life. My mother was an accomplished musician. She had studied at the Cincinnati College of Music before she married my father in 1888. Our family moved to Washington, D.C. in 1897 when my father was elected to serve for Kentucky's 1st Congressional District. You may have heard of him. His name was Charles K. Wheeler. He was a well-known attorney in Paducah for most of his life. In those days, Washington was a big city, just as it is today. There were always many concerts to attend and government functions that hosted some of our country's most well-known musicians. My mother always made it a priority for us to attend these events. She said, for a young Paducah girl from a town of 13,000 people, you have the opportunity to see and learn more than 12,999 of them. I think now it was because she was a little regretful. She had sacrificed a promising career when she married my father, that she so strongly encouraged my musical training, and encourage it she did. After I graduated from Paducah High School in 1908, she sent me to study voice at the Gardner School in New York. She hired private coaches for me both there and later in Chicago, and she helped me find work singing light concert songs, art songs, and operatic arias. Then along came World War I, and patriotic as I was, I volunteered for foreign service with the American Red Cross. For the next year and a half, I helped the war effort doing the only thing I had ever learned how to do. I played and sang. My audiences were the convalescing soldiers in London and France. The war to end all wars never did that, but at least one good thing did come out of it for me. It made all the pieces fall into place just right so that I was led to Chicago, where I met the man I was to marry. He was a businessman, warm, tender, and caring. He was funny and charming, and just a little shy. And I knew from the moment I met him that he was the one. Unlike my mother, I was absolutely certain that I was willing to give up how I made my living for what would make me happy, and I would never regret it. Unfortunately, he became very ill with appendicitis 2 weeks before we were to be married. In those days, medicine was nothing like it is today. The doctors tried to help, but they just couldn't. Well, after that, I threw myself into my music. I was unable to bring myself to return to Chicago, so I re-enlisted in the Red Cross to do similar work as before, but this time in our nation's capital. I resumed my singing career in Washington also. I began to teach and began working toward a degree in voice and another in musicology at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music in 1925. I attended mostly during the summer terms for the next 12 years, while continuing my private recitals and teaching in Kentucky, Georgia, Ohio, and Virginia. In 1926, I took a job teaching at the Hindman Settlement School in Hindman, Kentucky. It was a rural settlement school designed to educate the children of mountain families. It was to be my first exposure to the people and songs of the Kentucky mountains. At that time, there was a nationwide interest in folklore, and my professors in Cincinnati encouraged me to bring back as many of the mountain songs and information as I could, so I began to compile a collection. My friends and family thought it quite odd that I should suddenly be struck by the urge to move to the remote Kentucky mountains to teach and study music, but I just told them it's something I want to do. Living among those mountain people enabled me to delve totally and completely into their music. I can still recall the many trips up Troublesome Creek by wagon or just by mule to the cabins scattered across those hills. I usually took small gifts for the families, such as a packet of needles or a dress pattern, and their shyness was soon overcome. I lost track of the hours I spent in their homes listening to the ancient ballads of unrequited love, jealous lovers, and violent murders, sung as the women rocked their babies. They often said to me when I sang the written version back to them, "That speaks it so plain." Well, that collection soon became a published book, which did quite well. Within a couple of years while teaching at Paducah Junior College, I became interested in the songs of the Ohio River and the packet boat era, and began collecting those and putting them together for another book. Since I had grown up watching those boats pass near my home in Paducah, we lived right down on Kentucky Avenue, and listening to the songs of the black roustabouts as they worked on them, it's rather surprising that I didn't start collecting them sooner. I went up and down the river visiting the very old black men who as young men had worked on the packet boats before river traffic gave way to modern transportation. My collection was and still is the only one ever compiled that was devoted exclusively to the roustabouts of the Ohio River. My next book, Steamboatin' Days, was planned to be just a collection of songs and melodies and nothing more, but I soon realized that without some knowledge of the river and river boats, the words to many of the songs just didn't make sense. So I researched and expanded it to include the histories of steamboats on the Ohio, Mississippi, and Tennessee rivers. I also included many of the experiences of the steamboat captains and detailed descriptions of the boats and life on them. I was very proud of those books and of the fact that I was able in some way to help preserve the lives and spirits of those mountaineers and roustabouts before they were lost completely. What I preferred to be remembered for, though, was my teaching. To think that I could help introduce someone else to music, that was what I was most proud of. Music was my life, and I was so glad I had it so many times. As a child, I took it for granted, as children often do. But as I grew older, I learned to truly appreciate it. I realized it had become my companion, and I was devoted to it. It fed me, it taught me, it made me happy. Many people look their entire lives and never find that. I only had it once before.